Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simchat to the dogim in the deep blue sea. Simchat to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftorah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and this week, Isaiah.
Yeah, we're back to Isaiah.
Yes, we are, Rick. We read from Isaiah more than any other prophet or from any other book. And just why we read from Isaiah this week is something we'll get to in just a moment. But first, I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very fine coffee for a change, and talking Haftarah with my very fine chaver, the king of cantillation, Rick Muller. How are you doing, Rick?
I'm doing very well. Glad to see you're drinking coffee this morning, but I was wondering about your explanation for why this particular selection from Isaiah was made for reading on the Shabbat of Yitro, when the Torah reading includes the Ten Commandments.
And knowing me, you expect a very lengthy and very interesting explanation, right?
Of course. Indeed I do. I'll just sit back in my chair, reach for a cold one, water a course, put my feet up, and listen.
Well, Rick, I hate to disappoint or burst your bubble, but the answer to the question, why these selections this week, is, I don't know. And even more, I can hardly offer you anything close to a satisfactory answer.
No kidding. My pal Larry without anything to say. I never thought I'd see the day.
Now hold your horses. I said I don't have an answer to the question, but I didn't say that I don't have anything to say. Actually, I have much to say. I just can't offer a good explanation of how the Haftarah is connected to the parsha.
Well, you could read the explanation on page 451 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash.
I did, and I invite our viewers to do the same. And if they find the explanation satisfactory or even comprehensible, I will commend them. Or I could offer the simplistic explanation that both the parsha and the Haftorah describe moments of divine revelation. But allow me to make a few observations on the Haftorah itself to explain my befuddlement.
Allowance granted.
Thank you. Well, to start, I'll observe that once again, we're given a choice of sorts. The Sephardim read the entirety of chapter 6 of Isaiah, 13 verses in all, but no more. Us Ashkenazim add the first 7 verses of chapter 7, and then, or the first 6 verses of chapter 7, and then 2 verses from the middle of chapter 9. As I'll explain in a moment, in my view, there's absolutely nothing to connect these 3 sections, let alone anything to connect them to our parsha. So there's that.
A conundrum, you might say.
Exactly, a conundrum. But let's briefly review chapter 6. Robert Alter, among other commentators, identifies chapter 6 as the real beginning of Isaiah's prophetic mission. The prior 5 chapters of Isaiah were all poetry and were probably written later, perhaps not even by the self-same author. Our reading is the commissioning of Isaiah as a prophet, as an emissary of God. And Isaiah's appointment couldn't begin with a more auspicious in a more auspicious or grandiose fashion. His version of the Holy One seated on his throne, surrounded by seraphim, and calling out what has become one of the most famous and common of all the verses in our liturgy, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot Melech ha'aretz kivodo.
So that's the revelation part, like fireworks at Sinai, right?
True. And what then follows is the dance that occurs upon the appointment of many prophets, including Moses. Isaiah claims that he's not worthy. Why? Because he has impure lips. But one of the seraphim remedies that by purifying his lips with a glowing piece of coal from the altar, perhaps the divine altar.
Sounds like baby Moses and the angel Gabriel before Pharaoh.
Indeed, it is, although the story of Moses burning his lips on the coal is midrash and not connected to Parshat Yitro. But to continue, God then asks Isaiah, "Et mi eshlach? Whom shall I send?" To which Isaiah, suddenly filled with confidence, replies without hesitation, "Hinini shelacheni. Here I am to save the day."
Sounds like Mighty Mouse. No angels there, though.
No matter, same confidence. By the way, I'll note that the trope on this rather dramatic exchange is quite pedestrian.
Now, don't you go insulting the trope.
No, I won't. I know, I won't. But then it gets really strange, because what God tells Isaiah to tell the people is a prophecy of doom and despair. In verse 9, Isaiah is to tell the people, "Indeed, you must hear, but you will not understand. Indeed, you must see, but you will not know."
I think I once had a teacher who started class with those words. Maybe it's a divine ploy to get their attention.
Perhaps, but it gets worse. In verse 10, God tells Isaiah to do everything to make sure that the people don't understand, lest the people repent and be saved. God doesn't want the people to repent. The chapter concludes with God revealing to Isaiah that the towns and land will be laid to waste and people will be exiled, and only a Zerah Kodesh, a holy seed, will remain.
Okay, not very hopeful.
No, it's not. But then, as I said, the Ashkenazim go on, and we read 6 more verses from chapter 7. And these verses describe the complicated geopolitical machinations that take place about a generation later between King Achaz of Judea, King Pekach of the kingdom of Israel, and King Ratzin of Aram, and the Assyrians, who are coming to perhaps defeat them all. Isaiah and his son they are giving counsel to Achaz.
And what's that got to do with the prophecy in chapter 6?
Not a clue, nor with what it's got to do with the parsha. But then it gets even better, or rather more confusing, since we add those 2 verses from chapter 9, skipping ahead 2 more chapters, which go, "For a child has been born to us, a son has been given to us, and leadership is on his shoulders," etc., etc., etc. And so, I ask you, Rick, what has this got to do with anything?
Another conundrum.
A conundrum.
Well, maybe I can lift our spirits with a little trope talk.
You always do.
First of all, you know how I like angels, right?
Well, I'm more of a Dodgers fan.
Ha, very punny. Seraphim, the kind with wings, who call out, Kadosh. And then there's a pasek there separating Kadosh. And then Kadosh by itself. Adonai Tzavaot. That's a fantastic combination there. And it really separates each word, and it highlights each one all by itself.
You're raising my spirits already.
And then there's not 1 but 2 pazers. Sometimes we don't have any pazers in Haftorah. The first is on verse 11 of chapter 6, and the second one is the beginning of chapter 7. So those are markings of waking up and pay attention to the next piece. That's
They're
going to be
uplifting.
a little bit uplifting, yeah.
They are uplifting. I do love your pazers.
Right, and I know you love the Kadma v'Azlaz, and there's a bunch of those.
Yep, a good Kadma v'Azla will put bounce in my step and a smile on my face.
Not to mention a pair of Gershaims and 4 Zakef Gadols, 3 on the word Vayomer, or a variation, and finally a great Zarka Segol combination on verse 3 of chapter 7. Right, again, announcing that God is talking to Isaiah.
Rick, you've convinced me. There's no conundrum in a Haftarah that some good trope in your wonderful chanting won't cure. So why don't you just chant the Haftarah from the beginning to the end for us, maybe commenting as you go along, and we'll just listen and let the words and the music take us for a spiritual ride.
Okay, the Haftorah starts on page 452. and the bracha first. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Bishnat mot hamelech Uziyahu va'er'eh et Adonai Yoshev al kisei ram v'nisa v'shulav meleim et ha'hechal Serafim omdim mima'alo Shesh kenafayim lechad bishtayim yechase fanav uvishtayim yechase raglav uvishtayim yeofef v'kara ze el ze v'amar Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Meloch haaretz kvodo. Vayanu amot hasipim mikol hakorei, v'habayit yimale ashan. Va'omar oili chinidmeti ki ish tmei sfatayim anochi uvtoch am tmei sfatayim anochi yoshev ki et hamelech Adonai tzvaot ra'u enai Vaya'of elai echad min asrafim uvyado ritzpa b'melech chayim lakach me'al hamizbeach vayaga al pi vayomer hine nagaze asfatecha Besar avonecha v'chatatcha techupar v'eshma ekol Adonai omer et mi eshlach u'mi yelech lanu va'omar hineni shlacheni va'yomer lech ve'amarta Lam hazeh shimu shamoa ve'al tavinu uru ra'o ve'al teda'u hashmein lev ha'am hazeh ve'oznav hachbed ve'enav hasha ben yireh ve'enav Uvoznav yishma, ulvavo yavin, vashav berafalo. Vaomar ad matai Adonai, vayomer ad asher imshau arim, men yoshev. Uvatim mein Adam ve'ha'adama tishaesh mama v'richak Adonai et Adam ve'rabah azuva ve'kerev haaretz ve'od bach Assyria ve'shava ve'haita leva'er Ka'ela v'cha'alon asher b'shalechet matzevet bam zera kodesh matzavta. So that kodesh echoes the three kadoshes from before. So I just realized that, but there's another kodesh for you.
There you go.
And then the pazer, announcing the next piece. Vayihi bimei Achaz ben Yotam ben Uziyahu melech Yehuda Allah Ritzin melech Aram Ufekach ben Rimalyahu melech Yisrael Yerushalayim la milchama aleha velo yachol lihilachem aleha vayugad leveit David lemor nacha aram al Ephraim vayana levavo ulvav amo Kenoa atse ya'ar mipnei ruach. And here's the Zarka, again announcing a separate a prophecy by Omer Adonai El Yeshayahu Tzena Likrat Achaz Ata Ushar Yashuv Benecha El Ketzei Tealat Abrecha Ha'elyona El Mesilat Sedechoves Ve'amarta Elav Yishamer Ve'ashket Al Tira Ulvavcha Al Yerach Mishnei Zanvot Haudim Ha'ashenim Ha'ele Bochori Af Ritzin Va'aram Uven Rimayahu Ya'an Ki Ya'atz Alecha Aram Ra'ah Ephraim uven Rimayahu lemor Na'alev Yehuda unkitzena benav ki enna eleinu benamlich melech betochach et ben tav'al ki yeled yulad lanu ben nitan lanu Vati hamisra al shichmo vayikra shmo pele yoetz el gibor aviad sar shalom lemarbe hamisra ul shalom en ketz al kisei David Ve'amamlachto le'achinotach ulsa'adach ba'mishpat u'vitzdaka me'ata ve'ad olam kin'at Adonai tzavot tasezot.
Beautiful, Rick. You know, before we go, I just have a couple of observations about the trope. I don't know whether you have answers. Very often, it seems to me, the pazer is followed by a kadma ve'azla, which is usually preceded by a tlisha, either a gedola, ketana. And I notice in verse 11 of chapter 6, it's a tlisha ketana and a kadma ve'azla. But then in the first verse of chapter 7, after the pazer, it's a talisha gedola.
Yeah, it's more common, the kitana. So the fact that the rabbis put it to music the other way is dealing with achaz differently than with the first one, arasher.
And then, and then in verse 5 of chapter 9, we've got a kadma ve'azla followed by a talisha gedola, which seems to me to be not so common, especially when there's no other dramatic trope after that.
Yeah, you're right. It's just a different combination. makes you, if you're into it, it makes you sit up and look at it a little bit more closely.
And I know that our viewers and our listeners sit up and listen closely to your Haftarah chanting all the time.
One would hope.
And if any of you have any ideas about why this Haftarah was chosen, the selection was chosen for the Haftarah, or anything else you want to communicate with us, write us an email. Let us know. Rick's email and my email should be appearing on the screen, I hope, and we'd love to hear from you. In any case, we wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week.
Shabbat Shalom. Be safe.